An old woman who found love again, a heartfelt Western story of hope and second chances. Dusty Creek was a small western town surrounded by wide open land and dry hills. The wind often carried dust through the narrow streets, and the wooden buildings looked old but strong. Most people in the town knew each other, and life there moved slowly, just like the gentle flow of a quiet river. In a small house near the edge of town lived Margaret Whitfield, an old woman with kind eyes and silver hair. Her house was simple, with a wooden porch and a small garden full of flowers and herbs. Margaret had lived in Dusty Creek for most of her life. Many years ago, she had come to town with her husband, Samuel Whitfield, who was a hard-working rancher. Samuel had been a cheerful man who loved the land and the animals he cared for. He used to ride his horse across the fields every morning, checking the fences and watching the cattle. Margaret would often wait for him on the porch in the evening, smiling as he returned home under the golden light of the setting sun. But those days were long gone. Samuel had passed away many years earlier, and since then Margaret had lived alone. The house that once felt full of laughter had become very quiet. Even though the town was friendly, loneliness sometimes followed Margaret like a shadow. Still, Margaret was not the kind of person who complained. She believed in kindness and simple living. Every morning she woke up early, made a cup of warm tea, and stepped outside to water her garden. The garden was her pride. Bright flowers grew along the fence, and small plants filled the soft soil. She often talked to them softly while caring for them. After finishing her work at home, Margaret would walk into town. The walk was not long, and she liked greeting the people she met along the way. "Good morning, Mrs. Whitfield," the baker would say from his shop. "Good morning," Margaret would reply with a gentle smile. She sometimes helped at the small church by arranging flowers or cleaning the wooden benches. Other days she visited neighbors who needed help with small tasks. Everyone in Dusty Creek respected her because she was always willing to lend a hand. But when evening arrived and the town grew quiet, Margaret returned to her house alone. The nights were the hardest part of the day. She often sat on the porch and watched the sky turn orange and purple as the sun disappeared behind the hills. In those quiet moments, memories of the past filled her mind. She remembered Samuel's laughter, the sound of horses, and the happy life they had built together. Even though many years had passed, Margaret still kept Samuel's old hat hanging near the door. Sometimes she looked at it and whispered softly, as if he could still hear her. One warm afternoon, Dusty Creek looked a little busier than usual. A traveler had arrived in town. Travelers were not uncommon in western towns, but people still noticed when someone new rode in. The man arrived on a brown horse that walked calmly down the dusty road. He looked older, with gray hair and a weathered face that showed years of travel. His name was Thomas Hale. Thomas was a quiet man who had spent much of his life moving from place to place. He had worked on ranches, helped repair fences, and guided cattle across long distances. The road had been his home for many years. When he arrived in Dusty Creek, he tied his horse outside the small general store, the place where most people in town bought supplies. Inside the store, Margaret Whitfield was carefully choosing a small bag of flour. She greeted the shopkeeper politely, just as she always did. At that moment, the door opened with a soft creak. Thomas stepped inside, brushing a little dust from his coat. His calm eyes looked around the store before he walked toward the counter. For a brief moment, Margaret and Thomas noticed each other. It was only a simple glance, nothing special to anyone else. Margaret gave a polite nod, and Thomas returned the greeting with a friendly smile. Neither of them said a word, yet something about the moment felt quietly meaningful, though neither of them could explain why. After buying supplies, Thomas stepped outside and untied his horse. Before leaving, he looked once more at the peaceful little town around him. Dusty Creek felt different from the other places he had visited. It felt calm, almost welcoming. Not far away, Margaret slowly walked home with her small bag of groceries. The warm wind moved gently across the fields, and the evening sun painted the sky with soft golden light. She had no way of knowing that the traveler who had just arrived in town would soon bring an unexpected change to her quiet life. The days in Dusty Creek continued to move slowly, just as they always had. The wind carried dust through the streets. Horses walked calmly along the wooden paths, and the townspeople followed their simple routines. But since the arrival of Thomas Hale, a quiet change had begun to take place in the town. Thomas decided to stay in Dusty Creek for a while. He rented a small room above the blacksmith shop and offered his help to anyone who needed an extra pair of hands. In western towns, a hard-working person was always welcome. Early each morning, Thomas could be seen walking through town with a calm and steady step. Some days he helped repair broken fences on nearby ranches. Other days he worked with the blacksmith, lifting heavy tools or helping fix wagon wheels. The people of Dusty Creek quickly noticed his helpful nature. "He is a good man," the blacksmith once said to a neighbor. "Doesn't talk much, but he works hard." Thomas did not ask for much in return. A warm meal, a place to sleep, and friendly company were enough for him. Margaret Whitfield also noticed a new traveler around town. She saw him repairing a wagon one afternoon, and another day she noticed him helping a farmer guide a tired horse into the stable. At first, their meetings were small and simple. One morning, Margaret entered the general store again to buy flour and tea leaves. When she stepped inside, she saw Thomas standing near the counter. He tipped his hat politely. "Good morning," he said in a calm voice. Margaret smiled kindly. "Good morning." It was a short conversation, but it felt pleasant. In a small town, even a few friendly words could brighten someone's day. Over the next few weeks, they began to see each other more often. Dusty Creek was not a large town, so their paths crossed naturally. One afternoon, Margaret was walking home with a basket of vegetables she had bought from the market. The basket was a little heavy, and her steps were slow. Thomas happened to be walking down the same road. He noticed her carrying the basket and quickly stepped forward. "Ma'am, may I help you with that?" he asked kindly. Margaret looked surprised at first, but she appreciated the offer. "That would be very kind of you," she said. Thomas carefully carried the basket as they walked together toward Margaret's house. The road was quiet, and the sound of the wind moving through the dry grass filled the air. As they walked, they began to talk. Margaret asked where Thomas had traveled, and he told her about the many towns he had visited over the years. He spoke about wide plains, long cattle drives, and quiet nights under the stars. Margaret listened with interest. She had spent most of her life in Dusty Creek, but she enjoyed hearing stories about the open West. When they reached her small house, Thomas gently placed the basket on the porch. "Thank you," Margaret said warmly. "You've been very helpful." Thomas looked at the garden beside the house. Bright flowers grew along the fence, and small plants filled the soil. "You take good care of this place," he said. Margaret smiled proudly. "The garden keeps me busy." Before leaving, Thomas said, "If you ever need help with anything, just let me know." From that day forward, a small friendship began to grow. Sometimes Thomas stopped by Margaret's house to help repair a loose board on the fence or fix something around the porch. Other times, he simply greeted her while passing by on the road. One evening, Margaret invited him to sit on the porch for a cup of tea. The sky was painted with soft orange colors as the sun slowly set behind the hills. The town was quiet, and the air felt calm. They sat on wooden chairs and talked about simple things. Margaret shared stories about the early days of Dusty Creek, when the town was smaller and the streets were still new. She spoke about her husband Samuel and how they had worked together to build their home. Thomas listened with respect and kindness. He understood the feeling of loss. Though he did not speak much about his past, his quiet eyes showed that he had known difficult times too. As the weeks passed, their evening talks on the porch became a gentle routine. For the first time in many years, Margaret found herself laughing again. The quiet house no longer felt quite as lonely when she knew someone might stop by for a friendly conversation. Thomas also found comfort in the peaceful moments they shared. After years of traveling alone, it felt good to sit in one place and enjoy simple company. Yet deep inside her heart, Margaret sometimes wondered about the strange warmth she felt when Thomas visited. It had been many years since she had allowed herself to feel such happiness. And though she did not say it out loud, a small question had begun to grow in her heart. Could life still hold new happiness, even after so many years? As the sun continued to set over the quiet town of Dusty Creek, their friendship slowly grew stronger as the weeks passed in the quiet town of Dusty Creek. The friendship between Margaret Whitfield and Thomas Hale continued to grow. Their evening talks on the porch had become a normal part of Margaret's life. Sometimes they spoke about the past, and other times they simply watched the sunset together in peaceful silence. For many years, Margaret had lived with a heavy feeling of loneliness. But now, when Thomas visited, her small house felt warm again. His calm voice and gentle smile brought a sense of comfort she had not felt in a long time. However, deep inside her heart, Margaret also felt something else, uncertainty. One evening, after Thomas had left, Margaret sat alone on her porch. The sky had already turned dark, and the stars slowly appeared above the quiet fields. She looked toward the door, where Samuel's old hat still hung on the wooden hook. Her memories returned once again. She remembered the early days of her life in Dusty Creek. She remembered how Samuel used to laugh loudly and how proud he had been of their little home. He had always treated her with kindness and care. Margaret sighed softly. "I never thought life would change so much," she whispered to herself. She began to wonder if it was wrong to feel happy again. For so many years, she had believed that her heart belonged only to the memories of her husband. Now, when she laughed with Thomas or shared stories with him, she sometimes felt a quiet sense of guilt. The next few days felt different. Margaret still greeted Thomas politely when she saw him in town, but she no longer invited him to sit on the porch in the evening. Her words were kind, but she seemed distant. Thomas noticed a change. Thomas was a thoughtful man who paid attention to small details. He could see that Margaret was worried about something, even though she tried to hide it behind her gentle smile. One afternoon, Thomas found Margaret in her garden. She was watering the flowers slowly, carefully pouring water around the small plants. Thomas walked up to the fence. "Good afternoon, Margaret," he said softly. Margaret looked up and smiled politely. "Good afternoon, Thomas." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Thomas could feel that something was troubling her. "I hope I haven't done anything to upset you," he said kindly. Margaret quickly shook her head. "Oh, no, not at all," she replied. "You've always been very kind." Thomas leaned slightly against the fence. "Then maybe something else is on your mind," he said gently. Margaret looked down at the flowers in the garden. The bright colors moved softly in the warm wind. After a few moments, she spoke. "Thomas, do you ever feel like the past is holding you back?" Thomas thought carefully about her question. "Yes," he said slowly. "I think many people feel that way." Margaret sighed again. "I had a good life with my husband," she explained quietly. "Samuel was a wonderful man. We shared so many years together. Sometimes I feel like if I allow myself to be happy again, I might be forgetting him." Thomas listened patiently. He understood that the past could be powerful. Everyone carries memories that shape their lives. After a moment, he spoke gently. "Margaret, remembering someone you loved is not the same as losing your chance to be happy." Margaret looked up at him. Thomas continued, "The past is important. It teaches us many things, but it doesn't have to stop us from living the rest of our lives." Margaret remained silent, thinking about his words. Later that week, the town of Dusty Creek held a small community gathering in front of the church. It was a simple event where neighbors shared food, music, and stories. Lanterns were hung from wooden posts, giving the area a warm golden glow. The townspeople laughed and talked happily. Margaret arrived quietly and stood near the edge of the crowd. She enjoyed seeing everyone together, but her thoughts were still heavy. Thomas soon noticed her standing alone. He walked over slowly. "Would you like to sit for a while?" he asked kindly. Margaret nodded. They sat together on a wooden bench beneath one of the lanterns. The soft light flickered gently around them. For a while, they simply watched the townspeople enjoying the evening. Then Thomas spoke again. "I once believed my life would always be lonely," he said calmly. Margaret turned toward him with curiosity. Thomas explained that many years ago he had lost people he cared about deeply. For a long time, he had traveled from place to place, believing that he had nothing left waiting for him anywhere. "But life has a strange way of surprising us," he continued. "Sometimes it gives us a second chance when we least expect it." Margaret felt her heart soften as she listened. Thomas looked at her kindly. "Allowing yourself to feel happiness again doesn't erase the love you had before," he said gently. "It simply means your heart is still strong enough to care." Margaret did not reply right away. But deep inside, his words began to lift the heavy weight she had been carrying for so long. For the first time in many years, she began to believe that maybe the future still held something beautiful for her. Spring slowly arrived in the quiet town of Dusty Creek. The cold winds of winter had passed, and the warm sunlight returned to the wide open fields. Small green plants began to grow again, and colorful wildflowers appeared along the roads and hills. For many people in the town, spring was a sign of new beginnings. For Margaret Whitfield, it also felt like a time for change. After the evening at the town gathering, Margaret had spent many days thinking about the words Thomas Hale had shared with her. His calm voice and gentle advice had stayed in her mind. He had not tried to rush her or push her to make any decision. Instead, he had simply reminded her that life could still hold kindness and happiness, even after loss. Margaret realized something important. Remembering the love she once shared with Samuel did not mean she had to live the rest of her life in loneliness. Samuel had always been a kind and caring man. If he were still alive, she believed he would want her to live peacefully and happily. One morning, Margaret stepped outside her house and looked at her garden. The flowers were beginning to bloom again after the long winter. She smiled softly. "Life keeps moving forward," she whispered. That afternoon, Margaret walked into town with a lighter feeling in her heart. The streets of Dusty Creek were calm, and several townspeople greeted her with friendly waves. Near the blacksmith shop, she saw Thomas repairing a wooden wagon wheel. He was working carefully, tightening the metal rim around the wheel. Thomas noticed her walking toward him and gave a friendly smile. "Good afternoon, Margaret," he said. "Good afternoon, Thomas," she replied warmly. For a moment, they stood quietly. The warm wind moved gently through the street. Margaret took a small breath before speaking. "I was wondering," she said slowly, "if you might like to take a walk later this evening." Thomas looked pleasantly surprised, but his smile quickly returned. "I would like that very much," he replied. Later that evening, the sky above Dusty Creek turned soft shades of gold and orange. The sun slowly lowered behind the distant hills, painting the land with warm colors. Margaret and Thomas walked together along a small path just outside the town. The open plains stretched wide around them, and the air smelled fresh with spring. They walked slowly, enjoying the peaceful silence of the countryside. After a while, Margaret spoke. "Thomas, I have been thinking a lot about what you said at the gathering." Thomas listened quietly. "You reminded me that life can still offer new moments of happiness," she continued. "For a long time, I believed my life had already finished its most important chapter." Thomas shook his head gently. "Life has many chapters," he said kindly. Margaret smiled at his words. She looked across the wide fields where wildflowers were growing between the tall grass. "For many years I felt very alone," she said softly. "But since you came to Dusty Creek, things have started to feel different." Thomas did not interrupt her. He simply walked beside her, giving her the time she needed to speak. "You have brought friendship and warmth back into my life," Margaret continued, "and I want you to know that I am grateful for that." Thomas looked at her with calm and sincere eyes. "I feel the same way," he said gently. "After many years of traveling alone, it has been a blessing to find such a peaceful place and such kind company." Margaret's smile grew brighter. They continued walking until they reached a small hill that overlooked the town. From there, they could see the rooftops of Dusty Creek glowing softly in the sunset. Margaret stopped and looked at the peaceful view. Then she turned toward Thomas. "I believe life has given both of us a second chance," she said. Thomas nodded slowly. "And I would be honored to share that chance with you," he replied. The evening air felt calm and warm around them. In that quiet moment, both of them understood that something beautiful had begun. From that day forward, Margaret and Thomas spent many evenings together on the porch of her small home. They shared stories, tea, and quiet laughter while watching the sunsets over the hills. The townspeople of Dusty Creek soon noticed a gentle change in Margaret. Her smile seemed brighter, and her house once again felt full of life. Sometimes neighbors would pass by and see Margaret and Thomas sitting side by side, enjoying the peaceful evenings. And it reminded everyone in the town of something simple but powerful. No matter how many years pass, the heart is always capable of hope.